I'm delighted to be joined by the Right Honourable Liz Truss, the former British Prime Minister, also former Foreign Secretary, a plethora of other positions. You're also the author of 10 Years to Save the West, so thank you very much for joining Newsweek. I guess the place to start is, tragically, Charlie Kirk was murdered last week. I was wondering if he's someone you know and how you think the Conservative movement should react to it.
So I met Charlie Kirk when he was over in the UK earlier this year. He's a fantastic guy. We were very keen to work with him on how we could help, change Britain and Europe, learn the lessons of what he'd built in the US, reaching out to young people, talking about conservatism, talking about ideas. And what happened to him is just appalling. And I think what has happened on the extreme left, basically using intimidation, even being prepared to assassinate somebody, shows how wrong they've gone and how kind of anti-civilizational they are. So it was a huge shock. It was a huge shock. Somebody that I'd recently met, that we were all talking about, just suddenly gone like that.
I mean, do you think it's just a problem on the left? Because, of course, there have been some quite high-profile figures on or assassins.
Well, I don't see. If you look what happened to Trump, what happened to Charlie Kirk, we didn't see that kind of threat to Biden or Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
This is deliberate intimidation, and the celebration of his killing by people on the left has been absolutely shocking. Yeah. Including the President-elect of the Oxford Union. This is something that people on the left are justifying. They're saying that the end justifies the means, and I don't think you see anything like that on the right.
I mean, do you think the President of the Oxford Union, or the incoming President rather, should step down and not take up his post?
Yeah, and I think he should be removed from Oxford University.
Expelled from the university itself.
I've publicly called for that, yes. I don't think he stands up to the ethos of Oxford University. I think he's brought shame on the institution.
On Saturday, there was a very large protest in London, something between 110,000 according to the Met, 150,000 according to the BBC, called Unite the Kingdom.
Yeah, I was about to say, the numbers are very disputed,
yes,
aren't they?
The organisers gave even higher.
You would have thought with AI that a definitive answer could be produced with aerial footage, but anyway. I'll leave that to Newsweek.
But a combination of that and the rise of reform, of course, now leading the polls in the UK, do you feel that Britain has its MAGA moment? Has MAGA arrived in the UK?
Well, I want Britain to have its MAGA moment. And in 10 years to save the West, that is what I called for. I said, we need the type of revolution that we're seeing in the US, the MAGA, the independent media revolution, and now the Trump revolution. Yeah. That is exactly what we need in Britain and Europe. Otherwise, we are in very, very serious trouble. So I want to see that. I think that the uprising from the public is evident. Look at the protests outside migrant hotels, look at the Unite the Kingdom rally, look at the support for reform. All of those things point to a very, very unhappy public. Yeah. But there's a big difference between that and the actual actions that are required to change Britain. And that is the issue we've got. And if you look at America, some of that movement started way back in the Tea Party. And it took quite a long time. It took Trump 1 for Trump to learn how you actually deal with the deep state, how you deal with the leftist forces. And he's now learned that, and that's why we're seeing all the success of Trump too. But I think Britain's got quite a long way to go.
I did an interview last year with Steve Bannon, where Bannon controversially called Tommy Robinson a hero. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I was actually interviewed by Steve Bannon, I think it was in 2023, and he also said that, and he talked about Robinson talking about the grooming gangs. And I think it is correct that Tommy Robinson drew attention to a problem and a heinous issue that had been brushed under the carpet by many people.
Do you think it's been unfairly demonised?
Yes, I do. But what I particularly think is there is this total double standard of people on the left who call for all sorts of crazy things, Jeremy Corbyn or Zara Sultana or whoever. They just don't get the same level of scrutiny and demonisation as somebody on the right.
Now, of course, the United Kingdom rally was addressed by Elon Musk, who's been intervening quite a lot in British politics, as has the Vice President JD Vance, who's been talking about the free speech issues in the UK. Musk specifically said, whether you choose violence or not, violence is coming for you. You either fight back or you die. Do you think that's a sort of a helpful sentiment for the world's richest man to be conveying?
I think it's a true statement that the left is using violence. That is pretty obvious. We've seen the assassination of one of the world's kind of most prominent, most popular right-wing figures. So he is right in saying that this is the tactic they are using. He's not advocating the use of violence in that statement, I don't believe. He's simply saying that is what's happening, and that is a true fact.
Now, of course, you as Foreign Secretary got a reputation as a big supporter of Ukraine. And the Trump administration has seemed to move from one position to another on Ukraine. So obviously they were talking about sanctions on Russia, then they had the Alaska summit. Now they don't seem to be talking about sanctions, but I know it's still a possibility because Congress is pushing for it. Do you think that Trump should be tougher on Putin?
What I think about the situation in Ukraine is that Putin cannot win out of starting this appalling war, which he started in 2022. And what I want is Trump to achieve that. And I think progress is being made in that direction, but it is difficult to tell until you get to the final position.
I mean, it seemed like Trump was on the cusp of imposing sanctions or fresh sanctions. And then, of course, he met with Putin in Alaska and that kind of fell away. Do you think it's being played to some extent? Do you think Putin sort of knows how to push Trump's buttons?
I think Trump knows how to push Putin's buttons. And I think if you go way back to pre the Biden era, it was Trump who supplied weapons to Ukraine. Yeah. And he understood the issues there. And I believe that this is it's a tragic situation that this war has gone on so long. It needs to be brought to an end. I don't want Putin to win out of it, and I believe Trump is doing what he can to achieve that. Yeah. But these things are not easy, and what we've learned about sanctions, and I personally learned this, is that they can be evaded. Look at what India has done with the sale of oil, for example, from Russia. So you have to be very careful about the way that sanctions are levied and the way that they're put on.
Yeah. Now, this week saw Danny Kruger, of course, one of your former ministers, lead the Conservative Party, join Reform. Do you see Reform now as a government in waiting? And if asked, if Nigel Farage were to call you up, would you be prepared to serve under him?
First of all, I think it's too early to tell what's going to happen in 2029, and I do believe the next election will be in 2029. Yeah. If you look at the betting markets, of course, Nigel Farage is a favourite to be the next Prime Minister, so you'd be crazy to say this isn't going to happen. I think the issue is, in Britain, and we've seen this through successive Conservative Prime Ministers and with Keir Starmer, is that whoever is in number 10, they're not really running the country at the moment. The unelected bureaucracy is incredibly powerful. We've had the farce this week of the empty planes with no asylum seekers being returned because of judicial, or legal intervention. So for me, the most important thing is who and how is going to change this system.
I suppose the problem the Tory party has is that a Reform supporter would say that you're talking about all this stuff now, leaving the ECHR, repeal the Human Rights Act, etc. Why didn't the Tory party do that when it was in office? And is Kemi now the right person to move the Tory party in this new direction to become the British MAGA?
So, why did the Conservative Party not do this in office? Well, a lot of these, so there are some problems that have been very long-standing in Britain. So if we look at things like the rape gangs, they predate the Blair government. Or we look at problems with judicial review, they predate the Blair government. Or indeed problems with the civil service predate Blair. But Blair made everything like 100% worse. The Constitutional Reform Act, which gave power to the judiciary, unaccountable power. What he did with the Bank of England that basically made them unaccountable. he created an unelected bureaucracy and made it very, very difficult for politicians to run the country. Now, why didn't David Cameron stroke the Conservatives in 2010 reverse all that? Because that's what we ought to have done. We ought to have reversed the Human Rights Act, we ought to have reversed the Climate Change Act, we ought to have reversed the Equality Act, all of the legislation I was talking about. Well, I think it was a combination of two things. I think, first of all, people didn't realise how bad it was. So it's only when you get into number 10, you realise that the levers don't work. And it takes time for that realisation to dawn. And I think we're now in the position that Keir Starmer has realised that. But the second thing is that too many Conservatives weren't really prepared to take the left on. They basically wanted to appease the left. So you go along with stuff like transgender ideology or environmental extremism, like the net zero stuff, or even Keynesian economics. They didn't really want to take the left on. So in that respect, they're a bit like the Conservative Republicans in name only in the US, who didn't really want to take them on. And, is Kemi the Donald Trump figure of Britain? I don't think she's demonstrated that yet. And I don't think she has demonstrated she understands what went wrong for the 14 years of Tory government and what actually needs to change in Britain to make this country great again, but also to make it governable again. It's just not governable at the moment, let alone great. So I don't think she's demonstrated that yet, no.
I mean, talk about lots of Liberal Tory MPs, obviously, kind of during the last government. Do you think there are still a lot of Liberal Tory MPs in the Conservative Party? And does that need to...
Can't you tell?
and does that need to... I mean, should
and a lot of them, I mean, one of the structural problems is a lot of the Conservative MPs that were left, because, some of the most, sound MPs were removed by reform, essentially. A lot of the ones left are left in the Liberal areas. So they're in places like the home counties or West London or whatever. And those, they are facing attacks from the left, whereas actually where the Conservative vote should be going is, to the right. So that is a problem, yeah.
Would it be fair to say to save the Conservative Party, it requires a purge?
I mean, the problem is, and this has been going on for quite some time in the Conservative Party, and it's at the root of the problems that I had, that Boris had, that Theresa May had, is that the Conservative Party has been divided for quite a long time. And there are a group of people who think, like me, that Britain's institutions need to be taken on. That they've been captured by the left, that they've been captured by woke ideology, by Keynesianism, they need to be taken on. And then there's a bunch of people who don't think that is true, and who think it's conservative to preserve the institutions as they are. And I think until you resolve that problem, it's not really a purge, it's more like it's a decision about what the party actually is.
We're expecting within the next few weeks that the UK, France and Canada will recognise an independent Palestinian state. And of course the Trump administration is firmly against this. Marco Rubio has suggested this would be effectively rewarding terrorism. I think
he's also said that it doesn't really matter what France
exactly.
and Britain and Canada say, and I'm afraid that's probably true.
Yeah, but do you think Keir Starmer...
I mean, it's all just ludicrous posturing by Labour MPs and the Labour government who are trying to placate the Muslim vote and don't want it to go to these Islamists and the sort of Hezbollah party. I mean, that's what it's about.
So
and I think
it's
an appalling dereliction of duty.
You think Labour faces a real, genuine threat from Islamist politics in some of its core constituencies?
Yes. If you look at people like Jess Phillips or Wes Streeting, they're on knife-thin majorities. And this is why they're not actually doing what they ought to be doing, such as taking on the rape gangs. This is why they're not doing it, because they're scared.
Now, conservatism has changed a lot, certainly in America in the past few years. One of the big issues where it's changed has been economic policy. So, of course, traditionally the Conservatives were the party of the free markets, or the Republicans were the party of free markets. Trump has imposed sweeping tariffs on most of America's trade partners. Do you think this new conservatism is less market-friendly than the old conservatism? And would you like to see sort of similar tariff policies in the UK?
First of all, he has pursued free market policies when it comes to domestic regulation in America. He's deregulated through the One Big Beautiful Bill. He's cut taxes. So I don't think it's fair to say he's pursuing a left-wing economic policy. What he's no longer in favour of, or what he's saying America is no longer in favour, is unfettered trade with countries that aren't on our side, particularly China. And it was a massive mistake, in my view, for China to be allowed into the World Trade Organization. There were no special terms that, in fact, China was under developing country terms and still is. And they have free-ridden off the West. They've stolen intellectual property. They've used state subsidies, and they've decimated, Western, parts of Western economies. I've seen that in industries like the steel industry. So I think he's right to do that. And also, the European Union are a bunch of complete hypocrites. They've got very high tariffs and very high non-tariff barriers on things like agriculture, cars even. And he has basically taken them on and refused to accept an unfair playing field. And do I think Britain should do the same? Yes. And I particularly think we should do the same with respect to the EU. One of the things I advocated when I was in government is we should be, particularly on agriculture, we should not just give the EU free access to our market with nothing in return. And that is what we did. And, we did not negotiate well, in my opinion.
One of the countries who's been worst hit by his tariffs is India. And there's an argument that the West needs India to balance China. In the great power competition between the United States and China, India is a key player. Do you worry that Trump is alienating partners like India, Indonesia, Brazil, that we kind of need on our side to contain China?
Well, these are a careful negotiation, essentially, because, as I say, India was violating the sanctions. Russia, they were essentially playing both sides. So I think really what Trump and America have to do is force countries to choose.
Yeah.
And that's what has to happen. But what's been going on is that countries have been free riding. They've been taking the Chinese investment. They've been allowing China to take over key infrastructure in their countries at the same time as being mates with America. And I think we're moving to, a more polarized situation where countries have to choose. And I basically think that's the right thing.
Just one final quick question. You're obviously very passionate about all this stuff. Have you thought about re-entering frontline politics?
Well, I'm getting my ideas and thoughts out there, because the problem with being a government minister for so long is you're very constrained in what you can say, you're very constrained in what you can do and think about and who you can talk to. And I think the problems are so big in Britain that we do need a revolution, and I want to work to achieve that. But what I discovered is being in frontline politics is not necessarily the best place to do that, or certainly to do some of that work.